So I brought with me today a prop, show and tell. This is my dad's working hymnal. If you were familiar with the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church, in the 80s and 90s, this is the Gray Psalter hymnal. My dad was a CRC minister since it came out. He was a CRC minister about 15 years before this came out in 1987. And he used this hymnal multiple times a week for some 20 years to plan worship. And the edges of the pages are stained with the oils from his fingers. He's got notes written in it. There's liturgies in the back, so formal things in worship that they would say and do, and he's got notes written in, notes of extra things he wanted to say. He's got names written in of people who read parts of the liturgy to help him remember. In the baptism section, he wrote the names of kids that he baptized because he couldn't trust himself to remember them in the moment. There's even some sections in the creeds, which I'm extra curious about. I so wish I could ask him about this, that he put X's by. What does that mean? Why did you put an X by that part of the creed? I identify so much with him in that, by the way. Some things that I struggle with. Anyway, this is like an anthology of my dad's ministry, of good times and bad, of people that he loved, people that he carried in his heart. And it feels like home for me to pull it out. So the reason I pulled it out this week is because I had the words of a hymn in my head, and I couldn't remember whether it was the third verse or the fourth verse of the hymn. I couldn't remember which verse it was, so I pulled this out. The hymn is Amazing Grace, and it was on page 462, which oddly I had memorized because that was my life when I was a kid. I could open it to Amazing Grace, page 462, and I also played the piano in worship when I was in a different life. And so that was the reason I had them memorized. And I was looking for the verse, "'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." So I didn't have to remind myself of the words, just which verse it was. It turns out that it is verse 4 out of verse 5. And by the way, as I was reviewing this, I realized that I still have all 5 verses of the hymn Amazing Grace memorized, and many other hymns too. Like when I'm old, if I have dementia, I won't be able to tell you my name, but I will be able to sing all 5 verses of "Oh, love of God, how strong and true." Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The reason I had that in my head was because of a conversation I had with Beth King this past week. Beth is in a transition from working from home during the pandemic to needing to be in the office 3 days a week, and she's not too excited about it. She told me I could tell you this, by the way. So we were chatting about that over text, and then she said this: "With the situation in Ukraine, it reminds me of my mom. She was 11 years old in the Netherlands when the Nazis invaded during World War II, and the bombs and lack of food were horrible. She said, 'I have nothing to complain about. It's a good reminder for all of us to have gratitude.' Ellen and I attribute the good things about us to our parents, Betty and Ernie. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, Betty came. And Ellen's being aware of those dangers, toils, and snares that her mother went through gave her some courage and a different perspective on the struggles that she was going through. As Beth said, what could sharing and remembering such a story do but spur you to gratitude in your own circumstances? Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. What dangers, toils, and snares have been part of your story or your ancestors' story? We all have them. And telling the story about them is extremely important. And that's what is happening in the scripture that we're going to read today. This comes, again, from the Old Testament. We've been in the Old Testament a couple of weeks now, and God is telling the Hebrew people how to live when they make the transition from being a wandering people to a people who are settled in the land that God had promised them. So you may remember, or you may know, that the Hebrew people, who were God's chosen people, had been in slavery for a number of generations in Egypt. And God had sent Moses to liberate them from slavery and to bring them to their own land, where they could be established people and where they would be God's people. So they're getting ready to make this transition from being a wandering people to a settled people, and God is giving them rules, commands of how they should live as they make this transition. And there's 3 specific commands in this text for today. There's 3 specific commands. Give your first fruits, tell your story, and celebrate. To give your first fruits, to tell your story, the dangers, toils, and snares, and how God's grace brought you through, and the celebration, the party. So listen for those 3 commands as we read today. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 11. So the first thing God tells them to do is to gather the first fruits at harvest time and to bring it before God and their community. So this is how it reads. When you have come into the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it and settle it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall put it in a basket and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. Take the first fruits, God says. Now imagine these are people who have gone from a wandering existence to a settled existence, and this would be their first crop. These people are in their first year as farmers. Now, if you know anything about the life of a farmer, especially in pre-industrial days, what the harvest was, the content of the harvest, told them what their future would be like. Is this winter going to be a hard and hungry winter, or are we going to have enough this winter? And when it's your first year as a farmer and you don't have the stocks from previous years preserved, this is all that they had. And God says to them, take some of your first fruits. Take them and put them in a basket and bring them before the Lord. God doesn't give them the out to wait until they've harvested it all and decided if they had enough and then give God what's left over. God says, take your first fruits and bring it to the worship place. So continuing, next is an instruction about what to say. It's kind of like how we have certain scripted things that we do in worship, like the passing of the peace. I say, the peace of Christ be with you, and you say, and also with you. It's kind of like that. So we're starting in at verse 3. You shall go to the priest who is in the office at the time and say to him, today I declare to the Lord your God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. This is how they're supposed to start out when they're standing in front of the priest with their basket of first fruits. They're supposed to say, today I declare to the Lord your God that I have come into this land that God promised me. Today. It's a new iteration, a new statement every time that they come before, because this was a repetitive thing. Today, what comes next, what God tells them to do next, is a story to tell their story of previous generations, to tell the story of the past, but to start with today. It brings it current every single time that they do this, that what happened in the past, God's faithfulness in the past, has continued through the end of the story that I'm going to tell until today. Every day that they do this is a new length, a new section of that line in the thread tracing God's grace. So then the priest is supposed to take this basket and put it before the altar, because people back then and how they ordered things and how they understood God, the people themselves were not allowed to approach the altar. So the priest would take the basket from them and set it down. And then they're to tell that story, the through many dangers, toils, and snares story. Presumably with the rest of the community gathered around, maybe lined up, holding their baskets, waiting for their turn. And this is what the story that they should tell sounds like. This is verse 4. When the priest takes the basket from your hand and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. They're talking about Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, this is the time of slavery, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. This is referring to the 10 plagues. Do you remember the 10 plagues? With a terrifying display of power, with signs and wonders, and he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. You shall set it down before the Lord your God and bow down before the Lord your God. So take the first fruits, put them in a basket, and bring them to the worship place, and then tell your story, the through many dangers, toils, and snares story. It's the story told in my dad's hymnal. It's the story of Beth and Ellen's mom, Betty. It's your story. What is your story? Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace that has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. And the thing I love about how God commands it here is that it's like an elevator speech. Do you know what an elevator speech is? Like, I guess most traditionally it would be a salesperson. Like, you have to have your sales pitch quick enough, clear enough, and concise enough that you can be done telling it by the time the elevator door opens. It's a clear, concise way of telling a story. And if you're a good salesperson, you kind of have it memorized. Like, you can pull it up at any chance when you may come across somebody who might be interested in this product or this idea or this anything you want to convince somebody of. It's an elevator speech. This way that God tells them to tell the story is quick and concise and able to be at the tip of their tongue whenever they need it. God is giving them an elevator speech to share, with the command to share it regularly with each new today that comes. That's what Beth did. I could tell Beth had told that story about her mom in the Netherlands a bunch of times, because she told it in the span of 3 short text messages. And she adapted it to the Ukraine situation. What's happening in Ukraine reminds me of what my mom went through with the bombing and the hunger. And God brought her through. This is my interpretation of, this isn't the way Beth tells it. This is my interpretation. God brought her through, and God can bring me through too, and good grief, the Ukrainians. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. Grace will get me through this. Take your first fruits, God says, and give your elevator speech of what God has done. And then the last command is to have a party. At verse 11, then you, together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, shall celebrate with all the bounty that the Lord your God has given to you and to your house. Have a party. Doesn't get much more simple than that. Have a party. So it's interesting, though, the invitation that God gives in this command to party is to party with those who didn't have a basket in their hands. They're to party with the Levites and the aliens. So the Levites were their priests, and the Levites were not allowed to farm. They were not allowed to plant crops and to harvest because their job was to be the religious leaders for the people in their community. So the Levites didn't have their own baskets. And the aliens who reside among you, presumably people who were passing through, people who were outsiders up to this point, who hadn't been there long enough to have a basket. God says, party together. Celebrate the bounty that the Lord your God has given you and do it together in an inclusive way. Celebrate together. So rarely are Old Testament texts so easily relatable. Usually the Old Testament texts require a lot of extra translating and a lot of extra entering into, but not this one. Bring your first fruits, tell your story, celebrate, and do it together. I can imagine that doing those three things would make a pretty vibrant community. Bringing your first fruits. Can you imagine what the bounty of a community would look like if everyone was willing to share their first fruits? Tell your story. Can you imagine how knowing one another's story of dangers, toils, snares, and grace, if we could tell each other those stories, imagine the vibrancy of this community. Imagine the encouragement that they could share with one another along the way, the reminders of God's faithfulness. And to celebrate. Who doesn't love a party? Parties always increase the well-being of a community, and parties especially in a way that erase the line between insider and outsider. So as a church, we have room to grow in this trifecta of vibrancy. What was it again? First fruits, stories, celebrating. What was it? First fruits, stories, celebrating. As we are sort of figuring out what it means to come back to life in what, dear God, I hope is a post-pandemic season, these are worthy goals for us to pursue together. These are worthy goals for us to pursue together. You may have noticed we skipped the generosity moment earlier in the service, and we're going to do it now because this is a generosity moment that is flowing out of our scripture for today. And I want to talk about first fruits. I think the storytelling and the celebrating are maybe a little easier. They're easier for me to talk about, honestly. I would rather have preached a sermon about celebrating together or about storytelling. But what about the first fruits? Now, what first fruits means when you're a farmer is a lot more tangible, when you actually have fruits that come first, and you take them and you put them in a basket. But what does that mean when you have direct deposit that just sort of comes? I mean, you work hard for it, right? But it just sort of appears. What does the first fruits look like? Here's a way to think about it. Do you give God your best? Do you give God the pristine, that best shiny part of your income, of your bounty? Or do you give God what's left over? So to get it even more concrete, what do you do first when you do your financial planning? What do you do first when you plan for how you're going to use your money? Do you plan your giving first? Do you plan how you're going to share first? What is it that you do first? Do you do your mortgage payment first? Is that the first thing you take into account? or maybe your debt payments, or maybe something like cooler, like vacation savings, or maybe something mundane like a car payment. What is it that you do first when you plan for how you're going to use your money? Because what you do first will tell you the state of your heart. What you do first will tell you the state of your heart. If the first thing that the people did was to gobble up the first fruits, that would have told them and God something about the state of your hearts, their hearts. So I'm aware that as I say that some of you may not even have a budgeting practice, or may not even have a time when you sit down and decide how you're going to plan and spend and save and give. And that tells you something too about the state of your heart. And maybe for you, working towards first fruits is actually sitting down with the people who share the income in your life and having a conversation about what are we going to do with this money. So Billy and I have grown and changed in our giving in the course of our adult lives. At the beginning of our marriage, when we first started having regular adult income, it was me that pushed us to give regularly. But it wasn't out of the first fruits mentality. It was just because that's what I had always done. That's what my parents taught me to do with money, which is not bad, but not the best. But it's Billy who caught us on to the delight of giving, to the idea of setting goals for how much money we were going to put into our generosity budget, and the absolute joy of having money intentionally set aside that we can respond to spontaneous needs when they come up. So we do both a planned kind of regular giving, and then we have an additional line item in our budget for, it's just called the generosity line item. So it took us a while to get to that point, and here's a point along the way. It was a year or two after we first came here, and this church was in a financial crisis. And that was a wake-up call for us as leaders to talk about money differently, to manage money differently as a church, and to plan differently as a church. And Billy and I determined in this realization that we needed to do something different. We determined that we needed to model what we were going to ask of you. And if we were going to ask our congregation to increase their giving and to be more intentional about what they were doing with their money and being generous, that we would need to do it first. And then we'd need to expect consistory to do it second, so that we were modeling and leading in what we were asking you to do. That's what got us started. If we were going to ask you to give generously, then we needed to give generously. Somebody needs to go first. There were people who had gone first in previous generations, and we decided that it was going to be us. So on top of changing, and we decided also that we needed to change how we talked about money, to be more open about it, to be authentic and honest in ways that other people could respond to, so that we could have real conversations about money and really be transformed. That's how God gets in, is when we open up and we talk with one another about those closed off places. So what we decided to do is we decided that we were going to give a certain percentage of our gross income, which is before taxes, our gross income, as our first fruits giving. And then every time we get a raise, we replan and we set a new goal. And we've set goals like, okay, next year at this time, we're going to increase our giving from 6% to 7%. And then when we get to 7%, then we're going to reevaluate if there's this other organization that we want to support, that maybe we can set aside some of that and increase it to 8% so that we can give to this. And it is so fun. It is so fun. The planning and the dreaming and the goal setting for giving. And we've come to the point where we do it first. When we have conversations about money and what our coming year is going to be like, we do it first. The vast majority of what we give, and we give 8% of our total income at this point, the vast majority goes to the church because this is where we see God at work, and we want to be part of it. We want to be part of it with our whole lives and with our money. We want to be fully invested. And then, as I said, the rest is set aside in a generosity budget so that when the fund drive comes up on Michigan radio, I can say, oh, I can give to that because I have money set aside. There's always things that come up, needs that come up. And to be able to say, oh, I have money set aside for that is very fun. Generosity is fun. And we can do it because God has been good to us. Here's the storytelling part. We've been through some things that could have brought us to all kinds of ruin. Our kids' illnesses alone could have sunk us, not only physically and relationally, but also financially. But God has been so good to us. These are the dangers, toils, and snares. But also, there's grace that has brought us through. We've had amazing healthcare providers who have made so much of a difference in our kids' lives, who've allowed them to live. And we've been made aware of state programs at just the right time to help us pay medical bills. And we've had decent insurance. And we've had the mental resources to get on the phone to appeal denials and appeal them again until we get the answer that we want, or are sure that we're not going to get the answer that we want. These are our dangers, toils, and snares. We could have been sunk. But there is a thread of grace running through our lives. It is grace that put that health insurance in our way. It is grace that gave us the resources to appeal and reappeal. That's grace. And we are so grateful for all the ways that God has brought us through. And we put wings on our gratitude with our monthly withdrawals that go into the church. It's a little more inspiring of a way to think about it, is the money takes on wings and it travels from one account to the other. Our gratitude takes on wings with our giving and with that line item of spontaneous generosity. And it is so satisfying to see what God does with our first fruits. It is so cool to see what God does. I get to see it every day in my work, what God does through this church. Just one thing that I will share about what God does. It's a small thing, but a big thing. We needed a new boiler as a church. We needed a new boiler. Billy and I have been part of conversations. We've tried to help churches in two situations, not our church, but other churches, who needed a new boiler, and they couldn't pay for it, and they had to close. That wasn't our story, because God had given us the mental resources and the gift of good financial planners to help us think about our money and to plan for the future, so that we had money set aside for the boiler. That's a danger, toil, and snare, and God's grace that came along through the dangers, toils, and snares so that we could just pay for a new boiler. It is so fun to see the fruits of sharing our first fruits. God is so good. Imagine what we could do if all of us together, were giving our first fruits and sharing our stories of dangers, toils, and snares and grace that brought us through, and if we were celebrating together. Imagine what we could do. So here's something about first fruits. There are so many things that we could do if we had more money. Here's one of them. This is just one of so many dreams and possibilities. Between 4 and 7 p.m., depending on the time of year, there are kids skateboarding out on our ramps and our steps and our railings many days of the week. Next time you pass by there, take a minute to notice all the scrapes and the places where the cement is falling away and the way the trash can is away from the corner. Oh my goodness. I have moved that trash can back into the corner so many times, and I come back to church and the trash can is moved away from the corner, and I finally figured out why by looking at our Ring doorbell camera. Because the kids, if they can get all the way back into that corner with their skateboards, they can get enough momentum to get up on the ledge. But without that extra space, there's not enough room. So I move the trash can back into the corner, and they come and they move the trash can away from the corner. What if, so then every time I see that, I have this quandary. As a person who wants to be hospitable, I love kids. It gives me so much joy that they are out there with their skateboards, that they are doing something active, that they are with their friends, that they're experiencing independence, and that they're doing it here is so wonderful. I want the church to be a place that's safe for people to play, and I don't want our hardscaping to be ruined, because it kind of is. So do I yell at them and tell them to go find their kids, or do I give them, just let them be? What if we had enough resources to build a skate park? We've got lots of parking lot and empty areas. What if we had enough money to build a skate park? And not only to build a skate park, but also to do it in a way that we are intentional about taking care of the environment and directing runoff appropriately and making sure that we're not contributing to contamination in our streams. What if we could do that? That's probably, I don't know, $100,000? It's a lot. But what if we could do that? If we had first fruits, if we were a people who shared our stories and our first fruits, if we were a people who celebrated and dreamed together, what could we do? And the skate park is only one of a million things that are opportunities for life and vibrancy and faithfulness in mission. What if, first fruits could do that? First fruits could do that. Your generosity could do that. Your gratitude for the dangers, toils, and snares that God has brought you through could do that. So we're going to transition to communion, which, by the way, communion, celebration. We're living out this text right here. And as you get prepared for communion, I want to encourage you to think about one step that you can take to give from your first fruits. To not give from the shriveled up leftovers, but to give from the shiny possibilities, the abundance of the first things. What is one thing that you could do? Maybe it's a conversation you need to have with somebody, with the people who share your income in your house. Maybe it's one conversation. Because it's not always easy. We're not always in the same place. Maybe it's changing the order in which you pay your bills. Maybe it's setting up ACH, automatic withdrawal, for the first time. What is one thing that you can do to let your gratitude spur you to faithful giving? And we'll tell stories. We're going to work on doing that more. We're going to tell stories about our dangers, toils, and snares, and the grace that brought us through. And then let's celebrate. So I'm going to do the communion words of institution in a minute, and then I will invite you forward. And when you feel ready, you may come forward.